Hey everybody, it's Overkill here with another Warhammer faction focused video. So today we are taking a look at the denizens of Athel-Loren, the Wood Elves. So the Wood Elves are another old world race that split off from the High Elves after the War of the Beard. They took to Athel-Loren during the War of the Beard to hide from the dwarfs essentially, and the dwarfs then started cutting down parts of Athel-Loren to fuel their engines and their war machines and such. So the elves took it upon themselves to defend the forest. And after the War of the Beard, when the High Elves were expelled from the Old World, or basically they wanted to leave, the Wood Elves refused to join them and instead chose to stay in Athel-Loren and make that their home for the rest of, of history essentially. And they've been there ever since. So yeah, we're just going to talk about characteristics first. So they are the fastest army in Warhammer on the tabletop, that is. In the actual game, their infantry might just be slightly faster than anybody else. They don't really wear that much armor, so it would make sense. Think about an army entirely of skirmisher units. That's probably how fast they'll be, a little bit faster due to them being elves, essentially. Their entire army nearly consists of longbows, spirits, and magic. They have very few pure melee units, and what that means is pretty much all of their army is ranged and spirits of Athel-Loren. There are only a handful of units that actually are only melee, and of course we'll get into those as we go down the roster. They are the only true neutral race in Warhammer. They kill whoever approaches their lands in equal measure, so it doesn't matter who comes in, if it's orcs, beastmen, soldiers of the Empire, Bretonnians, anything. If they come near them, they're going to kill them. They're the only neutral race in the game. Even other elves, other high elves, if they come in, they'll fight them. They are the only neutral race in the game. They have access to 10 lores of magic, those being the 8 original lores, and the lores of high and dark magic. So, on top of already having the original 8, which is really good for a spellcaster, they have access to the high elves magic and the dark elves magic, which is absolutely amazing. They're going to be very powerful in the game with magic, of course. They have a ton of ammunition types for their longbows, which include poison arrows, armor-piercing arrows, and flaming arrows that are created specifically to kill good and evil foes. They have arrows specifically for good and evil that do extra damage to one of those two sides essentially. So like it's crazy. Of course, it's literally just they're enchanted in different ways so that it depending on who it hits, it causes extra, like, not magical damage, but, you know, it affects them in different ways. And nearly the entire army is in a skirmisher stance. So as I was talking about earlier with, imagine an army of archers, they're going to be spread out like an archer unit. Hardly any of their units are actually together in blocks, so expect lots of spread out units. So next we have geography. So Athel-Loren is the oldest forest in the old world. It is a magical but dark and haunted place where malicious spirits roam through the twisted undergrowth, and tiny darting shapes flit between the trees on the edge of vision. The forest itself is like a single consciousness and is aware of all that occurs within its boundaries. It is perfectly willing to crush any that enter its borders, whether they have evil intentions or not. The forest itself is self-aware. At the dawn of time, the trees began to think in ways trees are not meant to. The forest learned of feelings such as anger and hate. It became aware of the mortal races crawling upon the world and was not pleased with their intentions. Whether it was the old ones themselves that granted life to these woods, or if it was the coming of chaos which awoke the trees, none can say. Regardless, the forest has been inhabited by all manner of mysterious and often dangerous forest spirits since the earliest times. More recent comers are the Azrai Wood Elves, the descendant of elven colonists who made a pact with the forest following the withdrawal of the Azur, the High Elves, after the War of the Beard. Athel-Loren defies the natural laws of the world, and time does not flow normally within its boundaries. Individuals may find themselves lost within the forest for decades and return to find that only mere minutes have passed in the outside world. Equally, one might wander through the wood for a couple of hours and find that the outside world is unrecognizable as centuries could have passed since he emerged in the forest. The Wood Elves themselves are therefore forced to not measure time as other mortals do. To them there are only 3 times: the time before Ariel and Orion, the rule of Ariel, and the death of the forest, those being the past, the present, and the future. So we move on to society. The Wood Elves are split into 12 kindreds, which occupy their own realm of Athel Loren. Each of these kindreds is ruled by a lord and or lady. They all, however, pay homage to Orion, the avatar of Kurnos, and Ariel, the avatar of Isha, king and queen of Athel Loren. Talsin, also known as the Groves of Eternity, is probably the most important of Athel Loren's 12 realms. It is ruled by Lord Araloth the Bold. It is known for the strong bond between its elven inhabitants and forest spirits. It also contains the King's Glade, the home of Orion. The Wood Elves generally seem to live a peaceful existence within their forest home, but are constantly prepared to fend off invaders and raiders. They are secretive people and wary of all outsiders and intruders. They live within kin bands of varying sizes. Each have different ideological views, so arguments and disputes are common, but they all have a common cause in sustaining and protecting their home and preserving the balance of nature. So you can see that the information that relates to Total War, that is lacking. That's what these videos are. I'm not doing full lore recaps of these races, guys. These are just Total War related videos. So their information is a bit lacking, but they do have lots of lore. So if you do want to read up on Wood Elves more, please be sure to, of course, just check out the local Warhammer wiki or lexiconum, or even get a book somehow, if you can find the means to get it. But yeah, then we talk about religion. Like the Dark and High Elves, the Wood Elves worship the same elf pantheon as them, but like their cousins, they have selected certain gods to represent them and to worship them over the others. The Wood Elves have put Kurnos, god of the hunt and lord of beasts, the spirit of untouched wilderness, and Isha, goddess of harvest and of natural bounty, mother of the earth and bringer of fertility. They have taken the highest points in their pantheon. And how the elf pantheon works is the elves choose their god and put them in the middle, and around them in rings are the rest of the gods in order, essentially, of importance. So the Wood Elves use Kurnos and Isha in the same spot, whereas the other elves think of them as multiple, I believe. And the Dark Elves, as we talked about in the last the episode for them, they have Cain in the middle, and we'll talk about the Wood Elves in their episode, so look out for that coming soon. But yeah, not much to really talk about. It's not as it's not as crazy as the Dark Elves, for example, with how crazy Cain is and the cult of Cain and all that. They literally do just celebrate Kurnos and Isha pretty mild, not mildly, but you know, they don't have cults and such, essentially. But yeah, that has been the religion. So we're on to the military already. It's only been oh well, actually, yeah, this is usually how long it takes to get to the military for the other races, so not too bad. But yeah, we're going to talk about the military. So first of all, we have the roster, and you can look at that. Looks good, right? Okay, good. So the three legendary lords that the Wood Elves have access to are Orion, the King of the Woods, Lord Araloth, and Durthu. Durthu being a tree man ancient. But of course, we talk about the legendary lords after the military roster, so we will do that with this video as well. So first of all, we're going to get into the lords. So first we have the Glade Lords. So this is going to be your basic army leader. And as mentioned earlier, Glade Lords and ladies of, well, there's no Glade Lady model thing, but Glade Lords are the rulers of the 12 realms in Athel Loren. So these are pretty important people. Of course, on the battlefield, they're going to be really good at just sniping people. Basically, everyone uses bows. If you look back at the roster, I can literally point out that the Spellweaver doesn't have a bow. None of the tree units have bows, and like a couple of melee units don't have bows. That's basically it. But the Glade Lord, of course, is going to be absolutely amazing in melee, of course, because of how quick the elves are, and of course, he's going to be absolutely amazing with his longbow. So you can use him at a pretty fair distance, and he'll definitely, well, you can use him in any situation, he'll be fine, really. Of course, prolonged melee with elves is not really good, especially the Wood Elves, as they aren't the strongest race, but of course they can handle themselves quite well. So you don't really have to worry about them surviving, but of course you do want to be careful with them. And Glade Lords in the tabletop can be mounted on elven steeds, great eagles, great stags, and forest dragons. So yeah, a nice mix of steeds for, or of mounts rather, for the Wood Elves. Next we have the Spellweaver, and this is going to be your first caster. So they have access to all 10 lores of magic, as I mentioned earlier, high, dark, and then the other 8. So this makes them one of the better spellcasters in Warhammer, as they have access to so many lores. But in terms of just how good they are, of course, they don't match up with High Elf casters and Lizardmen, Slan, for example. But yeah, they can also have longbows, so they can be sniping people. And I think I might have said the Spellweaver doesn't have a bow. That was my mistake. But the Spellweaver can have a bow, so they're sniping people and casting spells all at the same time. And yeah, they can be mounted on Elven Steeds, Great Eagles, and Unicorns. So there's another different mount. They can have Unicorns, so yeah, that's pretty cool. We then have the Tree Man Ancient. Now, the Tree Man Ancient is just a very old Tree Man. Now, Tree Men are really the only type of spirit that stays in their body. That's how they can become Tree Man Ancients, basically. Dryads and Treekin are more spirits that occupy a body when needed. But the Tree Men actually stay in their bodies, so they are ancient. These Tree Men Ancients are probably older, or have been in Athloloran since before the time of the Elves coming in. So they're a little bit. They're not super fond of the Elves, as quite a few of the spirits are. But of course, they will work together to save the forest whenever needed. And Tree Men Ancients are actually spellcasters as well. They have access to the lore of life. So lots of magic from the Wood Elves, as you can tell. So we move on to heroes. And first off, we have the Glade Captain. Now, a Glade Captain is just a step down from a Glade Lord. But of course, in the lore, this is just a military commander as opposed to an actual ruler. Of course, they have their bows and their weapons and such. And they can take a bunch of cool weapons and all their enchanted arrows and such, just like anybody else. And these guys are going to be just extra, maybe training on the campaign map, and in the battle they're going to like raise morale and be a good fighter and be able to pick off people and stuff with their shots. And they can be mounted on Elven Steeds, Great Eagles, and Great Stags. We then have the Spellsinger, which is just a step down from the Spellweaver. Same mounts, a little bit less powerful in magic. They still have they actually only have access to the 8 lores of magic. As opposed to high and dark, so that's another thing that's different about them. The spell, if you want all 10 lores, you definitely want to use the Spellweaver. And yeah, again, they can use longbows as well. They are mounted on Elven Steeds, Great Eagles, or Unicorns. So next we have the Shadow Dancer. Now the Shadow Dancer is a leader of a group known as War Dancers. They lead groups of War Dancers around. They are servants of the elf god Loek, and they are the storytellers of the Wood Elves. Whoa. Now, I kind of have to describe War Dancers before we get down to their unit, but War Dancers are deadly warriors who leap over the enemy and twist midair to strike them from behind. They can dodge even the fastest blows and are capable of avoiding incoming arrows. War Dancers elegantly dance around their enemies and deliver fatal blows before they can react. So, a Shadow Dancer is just a very, very skilled War Dancer, and they're going to just be... I'm not quite sure how they would fit into the campaign map, but on the battle, they're going to be absolute beasts at killing people, in not even just 1v1, but taking on units, and of course, leading sections of War Dancers themselves. It's going to be a very effective flanking force, but yeah, I'm not quite sure how much they could be used on the in Warhammer on the campaign map, but in battle, yeah, they'll definitely be very, very skilled fighters. Next, we have Way Stalkers. Now, it's kind of similar to the Shadow Dancer in the fact that it's a more elite version of a unit that we already have, and the unit we have are the Way Watchers, and we'll get to them later, of course. Now, some Way Watchers become obsessed with becoming even more solitary than they already were. Now, Way Watchers are very solitary, and Way Watchers, just to describe them a little bit, are solitary individuals who wander Athloloran, and sometimes in packs, mostly alone. And they are the guardians of the pathways which lead into the forest. Now, so these are going to be the first people that these are going to be the first elves, rather, that anybody encounters. If they enter Athloloran, and of course they're just going to be able, they're absolute beasts, essentially, at sniping them as soon as they come into range. But Way Stalkers are just absolute, they've just gone, not primal, but they barely ever go to the Wood Elf civilizations in Athloloran. They always stay out in the woods, and when they do come to the field of battle, they are excellent snipers of unparalleled archery. So these guys are going to be absolutely amazing at picking off maybe characters and hurting monsters and such with their bows. It's going to be quite cool. And then finally, to finish off the heroes, we have the Branch Wraith. Now, Branch Wraiths are the sacred priestesses of the Sylvaneth, which are the tree people, essentially, imbued with the power of Giran. They are magic users capable of calling upon the wild woods to rouse Dryads from their slumbers to go to war. Now, these are the leaders of Dryad not packs, but you know what I mean. The leader of Dryad sections, whatever. And they are actually magic casters. They have access to the lore of life. So it's going to be very interesting. And Dryads, if you don't know, are not a race, but a type of the a section of the tree spirits that take the form of sort of a weird wooden elf, essentially. And they actually can lure people in the lore, that is. They can lure people into woods by looking like a beautiful elf, and as soon as they come within range, they turn into these wicked, twisted wooden monsters that just rip apart people with their talons. So it's going to be interesting to see them casting magic and ripping people apart and such. But we move out of the very long heroes section and move into melee infantry. So first off, we have Eternal Guard. Eternal Guard are the guardians of sacred places in Athol Loren. Now, when it is winter, the tree spirits often become weak, and of course, in the winter, a cycle happens where Orion dies and is reborn again in the spring with a new person taking his place and becoming his avatar, essentially. And the Eternal Guard must guard these places during the winter when the usual guardians, the tree spirits, are weak. And these are specially trained wood elves, trained in the arts of war, and they are going to be your first and slightly elite. Although in the tabletop they are a core unit, which means they're like a basic unit. They are one of the more elite units of the wood elf army, and they are going to be your main like holding line essentially, while your other things do flanking attacks and shoot at the enemies and such. And they're armed with spears and shields. So yeah, they are going to be a nice holding force. Now, next up we have the Wildwood Rangers, and the Wildwood Rangers are tasked with protecting, or guarding rather, a part of Athol Loren known as the Wildwood, where dark forest spirits have been banished due to them not really agreeing with the Wood Elves becoming the residents of Athol Loren, essentially. So these tree spirits have been, or these forest spirits have been banished to the Wildwood, and the Rangers are there to guard the border to make sure that they don't get out. So these guys are going to be very, very, very powerful on the tabletop. They wield great weapons, and of course, them being elves, they're going to be very quick. And on the tabletop, being an elf with a great weapon is very, very important, because most great weapons make you strike last in combat on the tabletop, but the elves have always strike first, so it cancels it out. So these guys are going to be using their already very high initiative to pretty much get their great weapons attacks in before anybody else. Now, of course, in Total War Warhammer, this might not be represented as much, as they'll just be swinging at each other just like any real fight would. But of course, if they're elves, they might be able to swing faster and do more damage than some units. But of course, they are going to be weaker as they don't have much armor, so maybe that's what the trade-off will be. But these guys are going to be very useful in a flanking force, or even charging into an enemy unit just to soften them up, and then finish them off with charging in maybe your Eternal Guard or something. It'd be quite interesting. Next, we have the War Dancers, and as I mentioned earlier, they are a very quick, unit. The War Dancers are just great warriors. They're made even more deadly through their war dances. These are the favored rituals of the Trickster God. No rhythm is called, nor are orders issued. Instead, the dancers instinctively enact a pattern of lethal movements complementing the dances performed by the rest of the troupe. Each war dancer leaps and pirouettes through the enemy ranks to music only she hears, gracefully evading her opponent's clumsy blows and ending his life with an impossibly swift strike of her own. So, yeah, I have no idea how this is going to be implemented into Total War Warhammer, but the War Dancers can use a different dance in every round of close combat in the tabletop, and these give them armor-piercing attacks, more attacks, a better save, avoiding the enemy units, and just making them less effective in combat, essentially. So it's going to be very interesting. In Total War, I'm not quite sure how this will be represented at all, but who knows, they might pull something off. Of course, I have no idea what they could do. So finally, for melee infantry, we have the Dryads. Now, the Dryads are the first forest spirit that we get to talk about. Now, Dryads are spiteful creatures with hearts akin to shards of ice. These are just the basic shapes. Or they've taken the basic shape of an elf, essentially. You can tell they took a slightly humanoid look. But some of them have like pointed ears and such. So they're taking the form of an elf, essentially. Out of their wooden bodies. When Athelloren takes to the field of battle, the Dryads assume their war aspect and hunt upon the flanks of the army. Their light and swift nature allows them to cover great distance at speed, falling with ease upon a foe who, until moments before, thought themselves entirely safe from harm. Indeed, a surprise attack by hissing and darting Dryads is oftentimes the first tangible warning an enemy army has that Athelloren marches against it. That or their general disappearing from camp in the still watches of the night, only to be found shredded and lifeless in a nearby glade at dawn the next day. Dryads are not known for their mercy. So these are going to be an excellent flanking force. They're going to be very quick, and depending on the battlefield, they're going to be very hard to notice, as if the battlefield's wooded at all, they're going to be near impossible to notice. So they're going to be very excellent for flanking, and they're going to be able to do a lot of damage. So next section we have ranged infantry. So first off we have the Glade Guard. Now the Glade Guard, as opposed to the Eternal Guard are an elite trained military group, whereas the Glade Guard are just any elf that wants to take up the cause to actually fight for Athelloren. Every elf is trained in the art of war with the bow, so these are your longbow infantry. Now of course they can fight in combat, they are trained to fight, but they are definitely more at home firing their longbows at units. So these are going to be an excellent core unit just to fill up a lot of your army with. And they are just going to be able to just lay down fire and just drop ranks and ranks of enemy infantry before they get anywhere close to them. We then have Deepwood Scouts. Now, Deepwood Scouts are, well, as their name implies, they're scouts. They go ahead of the Glade Guard, and they scout out enemy positions and, of course, are able to pick off enemies without being noticed that much. So these guys are going to be one of your first contact kind of units. You're going to march them up ahead of the army as even more of a skirmisher unit than the Glade Guard or the Way Watchers, let's say, and they're going to be able to just to pick off a few units without being noticed. Hopefully, I would imagine that the Wood Elves have some sort of snipe ability, like in Attila, where they don't reveal themselves by firing. So yeah, that would be quite interesting. We then have Way Watchers, and Way Watchers are as I mentioned earlier, the guardians of the entrances to Athelloren. So they are going to be excellent monster killers and snipers. They're going to be able to just put down volleys of fire onto a specific target and just absolutely destroy them. Now, of course, if you did want to fire a unit of Way Watchers at an enemy infantry unit, they would just flatten them essentially with fire. But I believe that Way Watchers will be more of an anti-character and anti-monster unit, as they'll probably be more powerful than the Glade Guard in terms of the damage they put out from their bows. So it will be interesting to see them. We then have melee monstrous infantry. There's only one unit, and that is the Treekin. Now, Treekin are a step up from Dryads. It's an animated hulk of deadwood, which is formed into a twisting, monstrous parody of an elf. It doesn't fight with finesse like most of the Wood Elf units do, but with gnarled fists that batter armor apart and pummel flesh to bloody ruin. So these are just going to be shock infantry. They're going to run in. After you soften up the enemy with your arrows, you can charge in your Treekin and just absolutely flatten and rip apart enemy infantry with these guys. It's going to be very interesting. They'll pretty much create a hole in the enemy army that you can fill in with the rest of your infantry if you so desire. I'm very excited to see monsters like this in Total War Warhammer. I just can't wait. We then have cavalry. Now, first off, we have the Glade Riders, which, like the Glade Guard, are just any form of elf that has access to their own steed, essentially. Now, they have the strongest bond of rider and mount in Warhammer, and they talk on a nearly subconscious level, where there is no commands from the rider. The horse and the rider act as one, and they can go through the woods at full gallop, and the rider can just twist all the way around and fire behind him and such if needed, and fire all around without even telling the horse what to do. So Wood Elf cavalry is going to be absolutely devastating. Now, of course, these are essentially horse archers, but they also do have spears that they charge in with. So they're going to be a bit of a shock and bow cavalry. So they're going to be quite interesting to see. And of course, they're going to be absolutely devastating, as they're some of the fastest cavalry in the game. So good luck catching them, essentially. We then have Sisters of the Thorn. Now, there's 2 units in this section, Sisters of the Thorn and Wild Riders, and they are the representatives, essentially, of the 2 gods, Kurnos and Aisha. So the Sisters of the Thorn are a magical sisterhood, essentially, that are servants of Aisha. Now, these units are very interesting in the fact that unless they are absolutely just mutilated and their bodies were destroyed, that they are reborn every spring. So I'm not quite sure if that might be a mechanic for the unit. It would seem kind of pointless to implement it for just 1 unit, to be honest. But who knows? CA could really do anything they want with this game, essentially, with the lore. So it could be interesting. And basically, yeah, they are also a magic casting unit. So the unit actually has access to the spells of the lore of life, I believe. Okay, rather, they have access to 1 spell from the lore of life and 1 spell from the lore of beasts. So that's very interesting. And as the unit gets larger, the more and more powerful it is. Of course, with Total War, unit sizes are set, so you can't really do anything about that. But it's very interesting. So it's going to be a pretty strong cavalry on the battlefield, also casting magic at the same time. And they also have access to poison attacks with their javelins. So watch out for these guys. Wood Elves are going to be a real pain in the ass to fight. Pretty much all of their units are ranged. So be prepared for that, guys, when they get added in. Because if you don't have anything fast or any other ranged units, oh, it's going to be brutal. So next we have the Wild Riders. As I mentioned earlier, they are the representatives and the bodyguard of Kurnos or Orion. They are basically going to be a shock cavalry. In the tabletop, they have the special rule Devastating Charge, which just allows them to do more damage while charging in. So these are going to be devastating shock cavalry that are just going to be able to rip apart enemy infantry or any unit, essentially, once they charge in. But of course, in prolonged combat, they don't have much armor, so they are going to be taken down. But these guys are just absolute monsters on the field. So it's going to be really cool to see them. And then to finish off cavalry, we have Warhawk Riders. Now, Warhawk Riders are similar to Glade Riders in the fact that the rider has made an exceptional bond with the hawk, and the hawk can do anything. They have such a bond that the rider can stand on top of the hawk while it's at full flight and just be able to launch volleys and volleys of arrows down at enemy units. And of course, the rider can lead his hawk down to attack enemy units. So these are going to be really cool. And of course, watching the Wood Elves stand on top of the hawks while it's flying around doing all sorts of fancy tricks and such, while it's also firing down, while the Wood Elf is also firing down at the enemies, is going to be really entertaining to watch. But these are going to be a really dangerous unit if you don't have much ranged, because basically, what are you going to do to get rid of them? Essentially, because they're very fast hawks, and of course, they're going to be firing down at you the whole time, which is going to be quite dangerous. So then finally we have monsters. So first off we have the Tree Men. Now Tree Men are the most powerful of Athalloran's spirits, and they're able to entwine their essence with that of a living tree, molding it to their will. So they take a tree and they turn it into their own body. So they live in this body for ever. They can't leave the tree, and only death will sever the connection. So these are going to be comparable to giants of other armies. I believe that the models are the same size on the tabletop, so in the game they will probably be the same size. So it's going to be really cool. Obviously they're going to be absolutely devastating. They also have one ranged attack, which is called Strangle Roots, where they just shoot little roots out of their hands, and that can hit a few people and such. So it's going to be interesting. They have a little short range attack, and they have these devastating, just scratching across the ground with their huge arms and just sending people flying and such. And of course, charging them into ranks of enemies, they're just going to destroy them essentially. So then the final unit we have are the Great Eagles. Now, Great Eagles, think of Lord of the Rings essentially. I know I'm definitely not the person to say like, oh, check out Lord of the Rings to learn things about Warhammer, but it literally is basically the same thing. If you look at the Great Eagles from Lord of the Rings, it's just the same thing essentially. They're these huge eagles that help the Wood Elves in their fights, and they just come down scratching and picking up people and flying away with them and dropping them, or just chopping them with their beaks and such. So you can imagine that these guys are going to be quite devastating to maybe units of goblins or other light units, of course, against fully armored things, and maybe even spears and other range units and stuff. They might be a little bit weak, they might get shot at, or if they try to attack spears, like I mentioned, they might get stabbed on the way down or something. But against other units, and maybe even cavalry, they might be useful against cavalry, I'm not quite sure, but yeah, they're going to be quite nice. And of course, Great Eagles are mounts to some lords and such as well. So yeah, that's the Wood Elf roster, guys. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the legendary lords that I have chosen. So first off, we have Orion, the King in the Woods. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of lore from the Warhammer Fantasy 8th Edition Wood Elves book. So Orion is the king of Athel-Loren. He is immortal, but his existence is tied to the seasons. Thus does he pass willingly into his own funeral pyre each midwinter, only to be reborn into thunderous life on the first day of spring. Each year on the eve of the vernal equinox, the Wild Riders select a young prince who will bear the mantle of Orion for the coming year. This chosen one is led to the Oak of Ages and given over to Ariel's keeping. There, she works the miracle of rebirth, sculpting her lost husband anew from the chosen one's flesh and Kyranos' spirit. On the following morning, the chosen one emerges from the Oak's embrace, a mortal elf no longer, but reborn as Orion, God King of Athel-Loren. When his realm is threatened, Orion is the first to fight in its defense, taking up his mighty weapons of war. He winds his great horn and calls Athel-Loren to the wild hunt. Every elf feels the lure of their king's wild summons, and many are overcome by this most primal of urges. Drawn to their king's side, they gladly abandon their civilized concerns for the thrill of the hunt and the tang of blood upon the wind. So yeah, Orion is the leader of the Wood Elves, and it is quite interesting that he is recreated every year essentially. Because it ruins his personality essentially, because not only does the new Orion have to deal with Kyranos' spirit himself, but all of the past chosen ones' spirits are in the back of his mind at all times. So he has to be extremely strong to overcome the voices of their past chosen ones. And it gets harder and harder for each new Orion, because there's just more and more voices in the back of his head whispering to him all the time. So his personality changes with every one, because of course more and more stress, or just the way that they deal with it, can make them more calm, more aggravated and such. So he's going to be absolutely devastating. And of course Orion is described as being over 10 feet tall. So he's going to be quite a sight to behold. And he can take with him his hounds, his 2 hounds of Orion. So they accompany him on the tabletop, and they're quite devastating. They can do quite a bit of damage. And Orion has access to his magical bow, the Hawk's Talon, and on the tabletop it has 6 shots. So it's going to be interesting. I suppose that the Hawk's Talon will be a magical, or a quest weapon maybe. He also has the Spear of Kyranos and the Cloak of Aisha. So there's lots of magical weapons magical items that Orion can go after in his quest battles. So it just makes sense for him, obviously, to be the faction leader and a legendary lord, because he just has so much that he could do, and that he could gain. But of course, it's going to be interesting. The Wood Elves are definitely the hardest faction that they'll add in. The way that they work in the lore just doesn't make sense for a total war game. That they never leave Athel-Loren essentially. So it's going to be interesting, because CA have said that they're going to represent every faction in Total War Warhammer. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to do it, unless they just say screw the lore. They'll go anywhere. But I don't know. I can't speak for CA, of course. But hey, that's my thoughts. I do believe that it will be the hardest faction to add into the game, though, because they just I don't know what kind of objective they would give them. So next for the legendary lords, we have Araloth, the Lord of Talsine. So Araloth was not always a hero. In his youth, he was a craven lordling who had not the mettle to hunt any prey that could hunt him in return. Whilst others went to battle in his stead, Araloth caroused and hunted in the company of worthless friends, and tried to forget his shame. It was upon one such hunt that Araloth was thrown from his horse and separated from all companions save for Scarin, his trusted hawk. After wandering lost for many hours, Araloth came to a strange glade. Though dawn had broken scant hours before, the lordling now beheld a crescent moon hanging low in the darkened sky. It was a scene to stir the heart, yet Erloth scarcely saw it. He had eyes only for the elf maiden who stood alone at the glade's heart, and the monstrous four-armed demon that menaced her. There at last Erloth found his courage, for even his craven heart could not abandon the maid to the demon's cruel pleasures. Before he realized it, Erloth was running to her aid, and his hunting spear soon gouged the demon's flank. The beast was swift, and Erloth would have perished from its counterblow, had Scarron not descended from the skies to tear out the demon's eyes. Blinded, the beast flailed madly, but Erloth ducked easily under its claws and thrust his spear deep into its black heart. As the demon fell dead, Erloth closed his eyes, amazed both at his victory and at the courage with which he had won it. When he opened them once more, the demon's body had vanished. Looking upon the maiden once more, Erloth saw at last beyond her mortal guise, and knew that he was in the presence of a goddess. So yeah, Erloth is going to be an interesting character. When on the tabletop, he is unbreakable. Of course, when he joins a unit, the unit doesn't gain unbreakable because of him, but he's going to be an absolute beast because he's not afraid of anything now anymore. He's been blessed by a goddess to give him unbreakable morale, essentially. And he's quite good at avoiding attacks, so that's represented on the tabletop as well. And on the tabletop, he actually has access to his eagle attacking enemy characters or monsters, essentially. So I'll just read the rules for the attack. At the start of each of your turns, nominate a single enemy model within 18 inches of Erloth. That model takes a strength 4 hit. If the wound is unsaved and the 2 wound roll was a 6, the model suffers a -5 penalty to weapon skill and initiative to a minimum of 1 for the rest of the game. A model can only suffer this penalty once. So he can basically make enemy units useless because -5 for most things brings it down to 1 or 2. So, and 1 or 2 is really bad. It's basically like you're just rolling 2s to 2 to 6s to do anything. So if he has this kind of ability in Total War Warhammer to use his eagle to attack people's like faces and stuff to blind them, it's going to be absolutely devastating. So it's going to be interesting to see him. And then finally, for the legendary lords, we have Durthu, the eldest of ancients. Now, Durthu is an elder of Atholloran, a tree man so ancient that even Ariel's millennia-long existence pales in comparison. It was he who first forged a union between elves in the forest, and he also who argued with his fellow elders that the binding be made permanent. In those days, he was ever a friend to the children of Aisha, always willing to help them broaden their understanding of the forest and of the weave. Alas, those days are long gone. Centuries of destruction and carnage have taken their toll on Durthu's valiant spirit. He has borne witness to the rapacity of blooded life, and of the wanton destruction it has heaped upon his homeland. He has seen untold acres of trees felled for kindling or from simple spite. He has watched time and time again as the elves have invited calamity on the forest through an inability to sever their connection to the outside world. Worst of all, he has seen his fellow elders fall, one by one, some slain by their own foes, but most destroyed by the enemies of the elves. So Durthu is just going to be an absolute beast, essentially. He is the leader of the tree men, basically. And of course, just like the tree men, he is also a wizard. So he has access to the spells from the lore of the beasts. So Durthu is kind of fancy in terms of his equipment. Instead of just using his arms, Durthu actually wields a sword. And of course, you can imagine a sword being wielded by something the size of a giant would be quite devastating. So he's going to be able to just swing that around and just destroy ranks of units, which is going to be really cool. But yeah, he's going to be really powerful, of course. And I look forward to seeing characters like these huge characters. I'm really looking forward to seeing on the battlefield, because any like human type general can be interesting, but like seeing armies being led by these huge monsters is going to be really cool. So hopefully we get to see him. That would be quite nice. So yeah, guys, that has been the Wood Elves video. I'm sorry if it was maybe not on the same scale as some of the other videos. The Wood Elves information is a little hard to read. A lot of the sources that I've been using for the other videos didn't have much on the Wood Elves, as they don't have that much information apart from like what they live in, basically, which is Atholloran. So I did manage to scrape together some information, and hopefully it was enough to make you guys happy. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. There's only 3 more, guys. So yeah, please be sure to tell me which one of the 3 you'd like to see below. The options are High Elves, Demons, and Tomb King. So I'll see you guys in the next episode. Goodbye.